Hey folks, Eric here from TOURNA-MIX, the ultimate mix competition website, and today we're going to be looking at another full mix walkthrough of my mix of Seize the Day by Manfellow. Okay, this is one of our songs over at TOURNA-MIX this month, and because the company Black Rooster Audio sponsored us this month, there's going to be a heavy feature on their plugins, which I basically used exclusively to mix this song. A couple of small plugins here and there that I brought in, like the SPL Vitalizer, which wasn't Black Rooster. I usually use that for mastering. But basically, it's going to be all Black Rooster today, and I'm going to just show you my mix of this song. Really, really fun tune. This mix contest, by the way, is still open, so if you want to join, go check it out. There's a link in the description below. We host 2 contests every month. It's a lot of fun. Go take a look. So let's just hear this tune and see what we're working with here.
When silence filled our room, it seemed we learned from guilt. We turned away, took different paths, no slight regret, no words to share, no trace of pain. I rest my eyes on empty frame, horizons bright, no gentle breeze. I realize I've changed my way, like a tourist in my days. I feel my life keeps rushing to tomorrow. I need a break to catch my breath, to keep an ear to the ground. I need to seize the day so I can live as sun goes by.
All right, so there's my mix of Seize the Day. Again, it is slightly revised from what was posted at the start of the month. When I got back from my vacation, I realized it was kind of dark, so I just spruced it up a little bit. Let's take a look at the processing. All right, so I'll probably start by showing you my drum processing, but before I do that, I just want to show one EQ that I added to my mix bus. This was the first plugin I added to the entire mix, okay? I found the production kind of dark. So I brought in the VEQ1P from Black Rooster and added a huge boost at 12K, as well as some subs below 100 Hertz. But listen to the difference with this EQ on and off.
My life keeps rushing to tomorrow. I need a break to catch my breath.
Right, that is a huge, huge difference, and I thought I would show that first because, again, it was the first thing that I did, and I kind of mixed into it. All right, so just a really killer plugin, killer EQ from Black Rooster. Now that I've shown that, which kind of informed everything that I did in the whole mix, let's mute everything but the drums and take a look at those. All right, so for drums, I did use samples. I brought in 2 kick samples and a snare sample, so these guys here sound like this. And those were a huge part of my drum sound. I actually tried to mix this song without using drum samples, but I just couldn't do it. I couldn't get the sound that I wanted. So I ended up not using the real kick at all. And I did use the real snare, but as you can hear, I brought in this snare sample. So here's my final mix drums. And let's skip over to the chorus. All right, so those were the final drums with all the processing on. Let me break that down for you a bit here. All right, so up first was the overheads, and here they are in their raw state. They sound perfectly good. You probably didn't need to do anything to them. Certainly wasn't any major issues. Let's hear them. Yeah, those sound good to me. I did bring in some Neve style saturation with the V Pre 73 from Black Rooster, bit of compression, and some EQ. So let me just bring those in. Here's the saturation. Sort of thickens it a little bit. Here's the compression. about 3 dB. And finally, I use this plugin to add some 100 hertz and some 10K. So raw, mixed. I also sent it to a room reverb, which I'll come back to in a second. So here's with the reverb. So that was my overhead processing. Then there was this little room mic, which sounded like this raw. And I made it sound like this. All right, so in this case, I'm driving it really hard with the V-Pre 73 and also rolling off some high end to make it kind of sound more like a room mic, like a darker kind of sound. And then some, fairly heavy compression with the Black Ash SC5. All right, so that was that. And then as I mentioned, I did use samples. So here's my first kick sample that I tried to bring in. So it has a bit of room on it. And the second one, more of a dull, thuddy kind of sound. Okay, so those are the two samples that I chose. In both cases, I did use the Black Ash to compress them a bit, okay, and probably also EQ'd a bit with the VEQP, but nothing too crazy. Like the samples, they sounded great right out of the gates. I actually did attenuate some of the high end on one of them there, but there's not a lot to show with the samples. Like I'll show the compression, like just super gentle. You can see it just sort of kissing the needle, and this is the compressor on the other sample. But I mean, that was my kick sound, was just these samples, right? For the real snare, I did bring in a little bit more processing. This was a fairly big change. If I were to mute all of my processing, here's the real snare that was given to us. So let me just mute all the sends as well. Pretty big change there, and this is with the reverb. All right, so let's break that down real quick. All right, so 4 plugins in the chain. I'm doing an 80 hertz high pass filter just to get rid of the low stuff. Again, I'm using this little drive plugin to add some, to crush the peaks down a bit, add a bit of warmth, and in this case also brighten quite substantially. Let me just turn these other guys off here. So here's just the V-Pre 73. Big change. That's huge. It's such a handy plugin, the ability to drive and then just quickly darken or brighten. I really, really love this plugin. So then moving on to the compression. You can see here, not a lot. This is sort of like, slow attack, fast release compression. And then finally, this is a pretty big EQ. So if I turn this guy off, here's where we were. So scooping out a ton of 500 hertz and adding some 5K as well as some 200. It's off again. Kind of boxy. All right, so that was my processing for the snare. That was, some fairly heavy lifting there going on. And I even though I used a sample, like if you listen to the relative volume of this snare compared to the sample, like, obviously the sample is 80% of the sound, but I left the real snare in, hopefully for some realism. All right, and coming back to that, I did send it to some reverb. That's with the reverb. You can see this is my drum room over here that I created. It's like a sort of an artificial drum room because I didn't really love the room that was provided, so I created one, and I'll come back to that in a second. So I'm sending the snare to that as well as to a plate reverb, which we'll come back to. All right, so again, here's with the sample though. You can hear, like, if I mute the real snare, we really just have that sample, which is pretty fake. So I think it's better with it. All right, so that was the kick and snare. Now on drum bus, I did bring in the Black Ash again to compress, as well as another big boost with this EQ. So, between the mix bus EQ that I added and this guy, we're adding a ton of high end to these drums, as well as some more low end at 60 hertz this time, and finally some clipping using K-clips. So let me turn this EQ. Actually, it's already off here. Let me turn it on in real time for you. See, really gentle compression here. Here's the EQ. Big, big change. All right, and then you can see here, I mean, during this little stretch of the song, we did 1.4 dB of clipping, so not a tremendous amount. So that was the drum bus processing. It helped quite a bit, especially that EQ. And then in parallel, I'm running my usual crush track here. We've got, let me see, what have I done here? Using 2 plugins. So this is the parallel compression. So a lot of compression here with the Black Ash. Okay, and this is, it looks to be a send, so it's from mostly from the samples. I am sending the real snare as well, okay? So it's kind of a blend here. You can see this send 7. There's varying levels of send into this parallel crush track. Let me turn off the Pre-73 though, because I can tell here I'm using it to add a lot of high end. Let me just turn this off. So that's just the compression. But then that adds a lot of snap. Kind of dull without it. So whenever you're doing parallel compression, don't forget that I think traditional New York style compression also had a lot of high end and low end added. So parallel EQ is also quite powerful. So let me just mute that parallel compression for a second. Just gives it that extra little bit of snap and support. Really, really like that. And then let me just quickly outline the effects. So I mentioned that I created this drum room. So here's my drum room on its own. Okay, now Black Rooster doesn't have a drum room reverb that I know, or any type of room reverb. They have a really, really nice plate and a really, really nice spring. So in this case, I did bring in a different company's plugin just to create a room sound, okay? And then I'm also using which one is this? Oh yes, the VL8 FET. So this is their 1176 to crush it down. So what's happening here basically is I'm sending, the send for this one is send 10. So if we just highlight these, looks like I, in the end, didn't send the room to the room. Okay, so I'm sending the overheads, I'm sending the toms, and I'm sending my snares over into this room. So, you know, if I were to turn these plugins off, we're just receiving signal from those tracks. So this is what we're sending into the room. And then by engaging the room, of course, we bring in the reverb, right? And then I'm smashing it with this guy here. Actually, I'm not smashing it. You know, 5 dB tops, 3 dB even. So that was my fake drum room. Now, in context, it didn't really add that much to the sound. If I mute it, here's without it. You know what I'll do? I'm going to mute the plate reverbs because they're kind of crazy. Let me just turn those off for a second. So here's again like the raw drums or dry drums with no effects. Here's with the room. Yeah, pretty subtle in the end. What gave me most of my ambience, and it's a little over the top, I'll admit it, is this Send 43, which comes over to the plate reverb. All right, so here's the plate reverb, and it's kind of funny. I don't remember making this choice, but I actually have a 5-second plate running here, okay, which is probably not timed to the track and a little bit too long, but I'm not going to change it now because it is the sound that I ended up with. So here's without the plate reverb. Let me just turn all these guys off. So this is a send from both snares, the real snare, the snare sample, and the tom sub. Okay, so I'm going to turn those off. So here's where we were. That sounds pretty good, to be honest. Here's with the plate, though. All right, so again, most of that is coming from the sample snare. Here's the sample snare on its own. And that's without the reverb. Very different sound. So you can hear the decay is kind of extending beyond where the next snare hit comes in. And, you know, a lot of times a good strategy is to have the decay of the snare reverb end before the next hit. So maybe like a 2 or a 3 second reverb would have been more conventional. But I can't remember if I decided, yeah, I like that long reverb or if it was an accident. But in the end, like with everything playing, I thought it was cool. So that's the final drum mix. Now, obviously, a large part of the sound is coming from the samples, but that's the age that we live in. These drums were not, it wasn't a great recording. I liked the overhead sound a lot, but I found the raw kick and snare, especially the kick, were just kind of, I couldn't get that big rock sound that I wanted. So, so that was that for drums. Let's bring in the bass. All right, so before I show the plug-in processing, I just want to show one thing that I thought was super important with this bass guitar, and this is not an uncommon scenario. Let me just pull the raw bass in as it was presented to us, and I'll just let me just clip it down to where it was. So let me just mute the basses that are actually part of the mix. So as you can see here, right at this transition point where the loop transitions to the real drums, right, it drops down there. You can see a big change in volume, and I found this really hard to make sound good without some clip gain. So I'm not sure why it got a lot quieter through this whole region, but essentially what you want to do is kind of create a region and gain it up so that you don't have that kind of radical drop in volume. All right, so what I did is I chose to, let me just bring these guys back in here. I chose to actually create two separate tracks because, again, this whole intro had one vibe. It's kind of high sound, right? And then it goes down low. So they need different EQs, they need different processing. So for me, it was much easier just to create two tracks and then gain stage, or clip gain, I should say, this little section up, okay? So if you left this as it was and tried to just compress it, it might have worked, but to me, there was too drastic a drop in volume there. You definitely want to try to get your gain staging going so that everything is even and and smooth. All right, so that was the first thing I did, was just kind of take care of that technicality. Let me get rid of this track here. Let's get to the bass processing now. All right, so once the drums kick in, here was the raw bass that was playing along with them. Okay, that's this guy here. Here's with all the plug-in processing. Kind of warms it up. All right, so it's kind of a thin sound. The first thing I did was just limit the signal a little bit, and I show this a lot, but whenever you have big transients that poke out like this, it's a good idea, I think, to just kind of hack off the worst of them. So you can see this limiter working not that much during the quieter sections, maybe 1 dB, but then in the bigger sections, got up to maybe, maybe 5 dB on the loudest peaks. So that's something that I usually like to do with bass when you do have these dynamics that poke out a bit. All right, then I added a high pass and a low pass filter. Okay, so 80 hertz high pass and a 4K low pass. Let me just turn that guy on here. So that's with it on. It's not a big change, to be honest. Okay, in solo, I don't even think that sounded better with it on, but I guess with everything playing, yeah, I thought that worked. Next up was the V-Pre 73, and this is, again, driving the signal, but also darkening it. So let me turn it off. With it on, just sort of fattens the signal ever so slightly. I mean, this cut here, this is up at I think 10 or 12K. So, cutting a bit of high end there. You're not going to hear that too much on a bass, but I thought that it warmed up the signal just a bit. Next was compression, 2 stages. We've got the FET combined with the 3A from Black Rooster. Let's watch those work a bit. So you can see about 7 dB with the 1176. Very standard kind of, slowest attack. Actually, I didn't use fastest release. So often, hard left and hard right is what sounds good on an 1176. It gives you that explosiveness. Let me just turn the 3A off. But in this case here, I actually found it better with a slower release. Let me show you the difference. So if I were to go fastest released, the bass kind of, to my ear, moves up and down too much. I'm hearing the release too much. But by slowing down the release, it sounds more even to me. It's not like popping up quite as much at the end of the tail. Yeah, that's too it sounds like it's pumping to me. That's much smoother. So release, does matter. This is a small detail, but I think those things do pile up. So then again, we have 2 stages of compression. If I bring in the 3A, got an additional 3 or 4 dB. Okay, so without the compression, it's a very weak signal, but with it, it's just way more solidity. Right, next up was the VEQ 1P. So this is what is this doing? This is actually rolling off more high end and adding some low end. So let me just get rid of these compressors here. So this is where things are going to start to warm up. Let me turn this guy off and bring it back in. Yeah, that's a big move. So 100 hertz boost and cutting 5K. Way thinner, right, without it. Okay, and this is sort of why, like, if you were wondering earlier, well, why did you high pass so high? I like to really get rid of the low end of bass a lot of the times to leave room for the kick. And then if I need to warm it up, I'll push up some 100 hertz. And that kind of creates sort of a resonant bump, right? We're scooping out everything below 80, but then pushing up a shelf at 100. So it really accentuates that region between 80 and 100. So I thought this was a really important mix move overall. Again, kind of thin, much bigger sounding, right? All right, then I added another limiter, and this is something I do a lot. Limit at the very start of the chain and then also at the very end. It's not always working. It's only catching some peaks. So very, very gentle peak limiting. And then I have 2 Pro Q3s, and these are triggered to the different kicks. So this is just a dynamic kind of thing. You can see here, it's like as the kick is hitting, it's lowering it. All right. And actually this one here is funny. The reason I have 2 of them is that this one was side chained to the real kick, which I never ended up using, but I forgot to turn this off. So this is actually doing nothing. We could probably just get rid of that guy. So yeah, some really simple side chaining with the kick here. You can see it's at 60 hertz. It's ducking, the bass whenever the kick hits. So that was the bass processing. If we listen in context with everything playing, it's quite a change. Let me turn off all that processing there. Here's the raw bass with the drums. It just fattens it up, brings it to life. Now, for the intro bass, it was a lot of the same mix moves. All I really did differently was the EQ was slightly different. You can see here, this time here, I've got actually a boost at 3K. I didn't do that on the other one. So I was just sort of tailoring the sound a little bit to try to fit with things. If I take off all the processing, it's not a huge change. It got quieter, but kind of brought it to life. I won't go through them all again because, again, it's a lot of the same settings, okay? But mostly it was just that the 2 Pultecs were slightly different. Again, this is the full-bodied one on the right here, where once the drums have kicked in. And for the intro, it just required a little bit of different. You can see the low end was the same, but I brought in some extra mid-range at looks like 3K here. So just tailoring it a little bit because they were different sections. I haven't really shown the loop yet, but like this intro loop. Mostly just cutting some subs and trying to bring out that snare hit a bit. Okay, so that was that little loop here. Not much to be done with that. I probably could have clipped it a bit just to keep some peaks down, but no big deal. So that's where we're at here. So let's just hear that transition, because this was a really important part of the song. And as you can hear, at least to my ear anyway, it sounds very, very convincing. It sort of flows into each other. But again, if you're a TOURNA-MIX member and you've already mixed this song, you'll know that in the raw state, that transition was not smooth at all. It required like quite a bit of work, at least for me. It was one of the hardest parts of the song. Let's hear it one more time. All right, let's move on from the drums and bass. Right, so I've brought in the guitars now, so let's just hear that transition with the guitars. Okay, we've got all these kind of things. But these were really, really well produced, I guess you could say. Like the sounds were really good. It's literally all I did for all of those tracks I was just playing was high pass at 100 hertz and add some compression. So like if we watch, one of the guitars playing, like I've got the VLA3A. Just compressing mildly. And And that's kind of all I felt was really necessary for these guitars, so I'm not going to go into any more detail. You can see I've got this Send 42 on all of them, so I did add additional reverb to them all, and this particular Send was actually a spring reverb, okay? So I'm using the Black Rooster ROSPR to add a bit of extra ambience, but even if I were to mute all of those reverb sends, let me just mute them all, I'm pretty sure they were ambient even in their raw state. Not quite, actually. Those are actually pretty dry. So I don't think there's much more to talk about with those ambient guitar tracks, but let's take a look at the rhythms in the chorus, these guys here. All right, so for these guys here, basically what I did, let me just turn them all off except for the gain plugin. This final plugin was just an additional 2 dB of gain, so I'll just leave that on. First, I actually did high pass up to 150, so this really thinned out the sound a bit. All right, so in solo, that actually sounds worse to me because you're missing all that low end. But that was my first move, was to high pass at 150. Then I added some compression, which, you know, these are distorted, so they don't really need compression. But I always find the LA3A just adds a little bit of bite to things. Very, very subtle, okay? Then I added the next 2 plugins were Pultex. Let me pull both of those guys up here. All right, so we've got the VEQ1P first, followed by the mid-range Pultec. All right, so let me turn this mid-range guy off. I'll turn them both off, actually. But for the first one, I'm adding 100 hertz back up. So I cut at 150, but then I'm pushing up 100. So it kind of just, you know, it lowers the low end, but then kind of pushes it back up. And I'm also adding some 8K here. So let me turn this guy on in real time. You can hear that it just adds a little bit of excitement. And then finally, I'm pushing up some 1K, cutting some 300, and adding back some 3K. So let me turn this guy back on. This is an interesting example. Like in solo, none of those moves really sounded particularly good to me, but I think with everything playing, it helps. Let me turn everything off here. Okay, I'll leave the reverb on. So this is without the EQs or compressors. Yeah, to my ear, the processing cleans up the sound. It just sounds a bit boomy or muddy without it. So that was the rhythms in the chorus. There was that little, you know, lead line here, this guy here, which I don't believe I really did anything special to. No. 250 hertz high pass filter. You can just hear it gets rid of that kind of annoying low end that you really don't need in context at all. And so that was basically the chorus. All right, so that's the foundation of the whole song right there. Let me quickly show you my vocal processing. So maybe we'll listen to the verse vocals completely mixed in context just for a second.
When silence filled our room, it seemed we learned from guilt, we turned away.
All right, so let's go through that. So I started with a simple 100 hertz high pass filter and a 15K low pass filter just to clean up the signal a little bit, okay? Into the V-Pre 73, which I used a lot in this mix. And you can see here I'm driving, but I'm also using the high shelf to brighten it just a little bit.
When silence filled our room, it seemed we learned from guilt.
Kind of dark.
We turned away.
Just gives it that extra little bit of edge with that high boost and a little bit of saturation. Okay, then I use the VLA2A, right? Mark II. This is a great plugin.
When silence filled
Probably about 7 dB.
our room, it seemed We learned from guilt.
Really like this. It's such a dark, thick compressor. It's just great. So that was the first stage of compression. Okay, then I brought in the Omnitech 67A. So this is a saturation plugin, and it also has like an EQ built into it. You can see I'm pushing up some treble here. All right, and using the input to saturate. I've got the whole thing though set with a mix knob fairly close to dry. So this isn't like a big change. Here it is off.
When silence filled our room, it seemed
A little bit edgier with it on.
we learned from guilt. We turned away.
Very, very subtle though. I had it up at 100% wet, but eventually dialed it back. So not a huge mix move. All right, then I did a little bit of de-essing. Not too exciting. Let me just move on from that. Second stage of compression.
When silence filled
See another 3 or 4
our
dB.
room, it seemed we learned from guilt.
Okay, so those were the two compressors that I used for this vocal. Next up, the mid-range Pultec for some more definition. So cutting quite a bit of 300 and then adding some presence at 1K as well as 5K. Let me turn it off.
When silence filled our room, it seemed
That's a pretty big change.
we learned from guilt. We turned away.
Okay, and then some limiting. Okay, this is at the end of the chain here, just a bit of peak limiting.
No words to share.
Hardly moving it.
No trace.
This is me, going to be 1 dB, maybe 2 tops. And then I brought in the high band, okay, for just a little bit of high end, and also cut a little bit of 100. So this is just going to slightly clean up the overall sound.
When silence filled our room, it seemed
You hear it take away a little bit of that low
we
end.
learned from guilt. We turned away. Took different paths. No slight regret.
All right, so without all the effects, that was my fully mixed vocal. I did use Soothe, but it's incredibly subtle.
We turned away. Took different paths.
Here we are,
no
raw again.
slight regret. No words to share. No trace.
Yeah, in solo, it's not a huge change, to be honest. Like, here it is again, raw.
When silence filled our room, it seemed
And then mixed.
we learned from guilt. We turned away.
It's definitely better, but even with all that processing, these plugins they're just not intrusive at all. They don't, sometimes when you're adding a lot of processing, it can get a bit harsh or just start to sound unnatural. With these ones, I just find it's super mellow and very, very subtle, but it does the job.
Took different paths.
And then with effects.
No slight regret. No words to share.
All right, so for effects, I'm using the RO140 on lead vocal. Okay, so this looks to be a 4-second plate reverb. Okay, let's see how I've got the pre-delay set fairly high. This is, I'm actually not sure where it is. I did it by ear, but if we look at the pre-delay, 85 millisecond pre-delay. Okay. All right, so this is a very long reverb. Let me turn off the other two effects. Just this guy alone is pretty ambient.
When silence filled.
And you can hear the slapback effect created by that long pre-delay.
When silence filled our room, it seemed.
So that was my first effect. I'll turn it off just so we can hear the stereo delay.
When silence filled our room, it seemed.
So I do this an awful lot. I feel like I show this in every video, but I'm using a very, very dark stereo delay. It's a quarter note, okay? And yeah, the width is set to maximum. So this just gives a little bit of excitement on the sides.
When silence filled we learned from guilt.
Turn the reverb back on.
When silence filled our room, it seemed.
And then lastly, I'm just sending to a little bit of microshift for a bit of chorus and a bit of width.
When silence filled
So that's the microshift on its own.
our room, it seemed.
And here's the full mix again.
We learned from guilt. We turned away. Took different paths.
Right, so that was lead vocal. Now the chorus was very, very similar. I won't go through the whole thing again, but I will point this out. In the verses, for example, I brighten the signal a little bit with this plugin. Okay, you can see a little bump there. But in the chorus, it was the opposite. I actually used that plugin to darken quite a bit. So there was a big tonal difference between the verse and the chorus, and that's not uncommon at all. So, even though I use kind of the same compression, same saturation, same, de-essing, all that kind of stuff, everything is basically the same. I did have to adjust, each EQ a little bit to fit the track. Here was the final mixed chorus vocals.
My life keeps rushing to tomorrow. I need a break to catch my breath. To keep a needle to.
So again, very, very similar processing on the actual lead vocal for the chorus. And then we just had these little doubles and, harmony tracks, these guys.
My life keeps rushing to tomorrow.
And for these guys, essentially all I did is come in and aggressively high pass each one at about 250. All right, if I turn off all the high pass filters,
my life keeps rushing to tomorrow.
You can just hear that it's really boomy, and obviously with like that huge chorus with the bass and guitars and everything going, we just don't need that low end. So I thinned them out quite a bit.
My life keeps rushing to tomorrow.
Right, and then I have the VP73 on every track, and in this case, using them to brighten quite a bit. Every track has like a lot of high end added, so if I take those guys off,
my life keeps rushing to tomorrow.
you can hear a really big difference. So between the high pass and those, it's night and day.
My life keeps rushing to tomorrow.
Big change, and then everyone got some LA2A.
My life keeps rushing to tomorrow.
Everyone got some sibilance control, okay? And then it looks like I added some VEQ5 to some of them here, cutting some 300 basically, okay? So, that was the background vocals. Pretty big job on those. I mean, that's totally raw.
My life keeps rushing to tomorrow. My life keeps rushing to tomorrow.
And I think that's all I'm going to say for the chorus. I already showed this big EQ on Mix Bus near the start of the mix, okay, and that was a huge, huge move. We also have some compression going on here, a really, really stiff compression, actually, way more than I normally do, but I find this compressor can handle it. It really is a transparent sound. I think we're hitting as much as 5 dB here. Let's watch it.
My life keeps rushing to tomorrow.
Yeah, on certain sections we're up to 5 dB, which normally I don't like to go past 3. It makes me nervous, but I find this compressor can handle it. Let's do a quick A/B.
My life keeps rushing to tomorrow. I need a break to catch my breath.
Yeah, I really, really like that. I do have the mix knob dialed back just a bit, so we're not, all of that compression isn't being felt, but, really, really love this KH Comp 1. It's probably the best compressor in their line for mix bus duties, and you could literally use this on every track. This, I just happen to love LE2As and 1176s, so I don't use this too much on a track level, but great bus compressor. I'm using about a 15 millisecond attack, quite a quick release at probably about 100 milliseconds, and I've set the internal sidechain up at about, I'm going to guess, around 75 hertz, so nothing below 75 hertz is triggering the compression, and I find that really important. This is super key. The minute your mix starts pumping, you can just dial that up and it'll stop reacting to the low end. So love this compressor. Then I've got magnetite going here, and this is just adding a bit of energy and love to the whole mix.
My life keeps rushing to tomorrow. I need a break to catch my breath.
I hear that as just adding some general excitement. Don't worry about all these gain plugins. It's just kind of a gain staging thing. I was just trying to make sure I hit my plugins at the right level. I'm adding a bit of EQ to the whole mix here, scooping out a little bit of 3K. I found the chorus a bit harsh, pushing up some 1.5K and a little bit at 200.
My life keeps rushing to tomorrow.
That one is pretty subtle, to be honest. And then finally, as a part of my mastering chain, I'm bringing in the SPL Vitalizer. So this is adding some width. You can see the stereo expander here. It's adding width and also some additional high end.
My life keeps rushing to tomorrow. I need a break to catch my breath.
So yeah, I really love that guy for sheening things up. And the main reason I brought it in was for the width. Black Rooster doesn't have an expander or a stereo width thing. And I am skeptical of stereo wideners in general, but I find this one seems to work for me. It's a really, really nice one. Finally, a little bit of mastering style EQ here. So this is the 12 dB scale, so it's not as crazy as it looks. I usually operate in 30 dB, but let's go back to 12 here. So yeah, just adding some subs in the middle, cutting a little bit of low mids and adding some highs. Very classic way to spruce up a mix. Let's hear this guy.
My life keeps rushing to tomorrow. I need a break to catch my breath. To keep a near to the ground I need.
So that helped give it more of a finished sound. And then finally some simple peak limiting. All right, and that was hitting about minus 8 LUFS in the chorus. I've got this gain plugin lowering my whole mix by 10 dB right now just so I can talk over it. But yeah, it was about minus 8 LUFS. So that was my mix bus and mastering processing for this song. And I don't think there's really anything else to show. I am clipping the all drums auxiliary. I didn't show that earlier, but I'm also clipping the drum bus. So this is just adding a little bit of extra clipping to the drums. But that's essentially it for this mix. Really, really fun song. It's a great piece of music. I really love the actual music and song itself, but a lot of fun to mix too. I wouldn't say it was an easy mix. I struggled quite a bit with it. And as I said earlier, I did do a revision that helped quite a bit after I got back from my trip. But anyway, if you like this song and if you like mix contests, come check us out anytime. There's a link below in the description. TOURNA-MIX, 2 mix contests every month. So if that appeals to you, check it out. And I want to give another thanks to Black Rooster for sponsoring both of our mix contests this month. Very, very kind of them. I hope I was able to showcase their plugins a bit today. So be well, happy mixing, and we'll talk soon.